School completion and basic digital literacy are known to be effective in breaking the generational cycle of poverty. But how can poor learners who have no access to computers at home develop basic digital literacy? They can do so through school digital literacy programs such as the South African Computer Applications Technology, CAT, curriculum. The skills developed through CAT make a person employable straight out of school, or for those who want to enter the higher education sector instead, it equips them to cope with the digital demands of higher education. Clearly, it seems to make sense for learners, particularly learners in poverty, to take CAT. So why did I find unused computer laboratories in each of the 15 township schools in which I worked as part of the University of the Free State's School Partnership Project? Why did not one of these schools offer CAT during the period in which I worked there? How typical were these of schools in the rest of the Free State and in South Africa as a whole? And what should we do about the matter? Hello! I'm Angela Stott from the University of the Free State South Campus, and these are some of the questions which led me to conduct this study. In the study, I used grade 12 examination data from all schools in the Free State from the Free State DBE EMIS database for CAT throughout the decade 2010 to 2019. And I also did this for the subject IT, Information Technology. IT is a more specialized subject than CAT. IT focuses on programming skill, whereas CAT develops more basic digital literacy. I analyzed this data with the purpose of answering these research questions related to the enrollment numbers and their changes, and performance quality of learners from Free State schools of various socioeconomic statuses. I'm going to start with a quick statement of my main findings, after which I'll go on to more detail about how I conducted the study and what I found and how I interpret this. Approximately 20% of South African schools cater for learners from richer homes and are relatively globally competitive. These are called high quintile schools. The remaining 80% of schools, which cater for poorer learners, perform at or near the bottom of international benchmarking tests, and they're called low quintile schools. Although CAT might be seen as a subject which can help poorer learners to break the cycle of poverty, I found that CAT is mainly taken by richer learners, and the gap in enrollment numbers between richer and poorer has widened across the past decade due to massive attrition from CAT by learners in poor schools. That's probably not because the subject is difficult, because performance was fairly high in all school types across the decade, with interesting fluctuations in poorer schools, which I'll suggest an explanation for. I found that IT is not at all popular, particularly in low quintile schools, and its popularity in quintile 5 schools, which cater for richer learners, has dropped drastically across the decade. Learners from low quintile schools tend to perform poorly and erratically in IT. This is how I'm going to structure this presentation. I'm first going to give a quick tour of where I accessed the data I used and how I used Excel to analyze the data. Then I'll briefly present my main findings. I'll then present the theoretical framework that I've chosen to use, as well as some information about education policies relevant to trying to make sense of the trends in the data. After this, I'll apply the theoretical framework and policies to try to explain trends in the data. I'll end with what I think that this tells us about further issues that need to be investigated. The Free State Department of Basic Education was an early adopter of the EMIS database. All school principals in the Free State are expected to see to it that the data about their schools is uploaded to the EMIS database. This includes grade 12 examination enrollment and performance data per subject, per school, per year. I downloaded data from the site for each of the Free State districts and all the schools in the Free State for every year from 2010 to 2019. I then combined all this data into a single Excel spreadsheet. I also downloaded and incorporated school quintile ratings from the National EMIS database. The quintile rating is an indicator of the socioeconomic status of the community which the school serves, with 1 referring to the poorest communities and 5 referring to the richest. The EMIS database also indicates if schools are independent, which means that the quintile rating system doesn't apply, and it also indicates if the school is a special needs school, meaning that the learners at the school have physical, mental, or behavioral difficulties. I then used Excel's graphing, pivot table, and statistical functions to represent and analyze the data in various ways to try to make sense of it. You can download my spreadsheet with the raw data, analysis, and graphs from a link given below. In this section, I briefly point out the ways in which I represented the data and the main trends that I noticed. Let's start with IT. I tabulated data for each year in the decade, but here I'm only showing data for 2010 and 2019. I looked at how many schools and learners took IT per school quintile and compared that with the total number of schools and learners of that quintile in the Free State to work out what percentage of Free State schools of each type offered IT and what percentage of learners took IT. We can see that this is very low for all, but particularly low for poorer schools. We also see a drastic decrease across the decade for quintile 5 schools. I also calculated the mean grade 12 IT mark and the fraction of learners who achieved above 30% for IT as the pass rate. In this graph, I represented the numbers of learners who took IT per type of school across the decade. We can see that regarding enrollment numbers, the decade started with IT being dominated by learners from quintile 5 schools, but these schools have experienced drastic attrition across the decade, while there's been a slight increase in learner numbers from lower quintile schools, particularly in 2018 and 2019. This graph shows the IT pass rate over time for the various types of schools. The bubble sizes represent the fraction of learners in that type of school that took IT. Let's start by focusing on the bubble sizes. We can see at the start of the decade, the bubble sizes for quintile 5 and 4 schools are much larger than for the lower quintile schools. But by the end of the decade, the sizes are more similar due to a decrease in number of learners in higher quintile schools and an increase in numbers in learners in lower quintile schools taking IT. Now let's focus on the height of the bubbles, in other words, on the pass rate. We can see that the quintile 5 pass rate is fairly stable across time and high. Quintile 4 pass rate is generally also high and fairly stable, although not completely so. The low quintile pass rates are very erratic and generally considerably lower. These assertions summarize what I've just been saying regarding enrollment, change in enrollment over time, and performance. Briefly, enrollment in IT was low for all schools, particularly for poorer schools. Enrollment in IT decreased drastically across the decade for richer schools and increased slightly for poorer schools. IT performance was high and stable for richer schools, lower and erratic for poorer schools. Let's move on to CAT. I tabulated the same information as before. Again, for simplicity, only the first and last years of the decade are shown here, but the full table is available in the Excel sheet that you can download from the link below. Note the inclusion of the independent and special needs schools for CAT, whereas for IT their numbers were too low to include. In a 2015 report, the Department of Basic Education reported that 24% of South African schools offered CAT in the first part of the decade. Now, compared to that, all types of Free State schools had a high prevalence of CAT in 2010, and although this declined considerably for the low quintile schools across the decade, all but quintile 1 schools still had a higher presence of CAT than this 2015 national average by the end of the decade. Also notice that here I performed a statistical analysis, which I didn't do for IT because of the very low IT numbers. In the statistical analysis, I excluded the special needs schools because they don't necessarily cater for learners from a particular socioeconomic background. I performed t-tests to compare variables for the poorer low quintile schools versus the richer high quintile and independent schools. I performed these t-tests to compare the numbers of learners who took CAT as a percentage of learners in schools offering CAT, as well as to compare the average marks and the average pass rates. All these comparisons showed statistical significance. I found that a significantly greater proportion of richer learners took CAT at the start and at the end of the decade. Grade 12 learners from richer schools achieved on average about 10% higher for CAT than their poorer counterparts. By the end of the decade, the pass rates were high for all school types, but even then, the difference between richer and poorer schools was statistically significant. Here we see a graph of numbers of Free State grade 12 learners from various types of schools who took CAT across the decade. We notice that throughout the decade, there's a higher number of learners from richer schools taking CAT, even though those attending richer schools only make up 20% of the South African population of grade 12 learners. We also notice a clear attrition across the decade, especially of learners from poorer schools. Notice in this graph that the numbers of learners in special needs and independent schools is very low. However, in this graph, we notice particularly large bubble sizes for special needs and independent schools. And that's because in this graph, the bubble sizes represent the number of learners who took CAT as a percentage of the total number of learners in that type of school. The largest bubble sizes here represent about 50% of the learners taking CAT within schools of that type. So clearly, a high proportion of learners take CAT in special needs and independent schools, even though very few learners in total attend such schools in the Free State. We see fairly large bubble sizes for the high quintile schools, with little difference between quintile 5 and 4 schools. And we see clearly smaller bubble sizes for the lower quintile schools. That means that a higher proportion of richer learners take CAT than do poorer learners. We also notice that the bubble sizes decrease more noticeably over time for the poorer schools than for the richer schools. Now let's focus on the height of the bubbles corresponding to the pass rates. We see that the high quintile schools have high and stable pass rates across the decade. The special needs and independent schools, in general, show an improvement in pass rate across the decade. The low quintile schools seem to show an improvement up to 2013, then a decline, and then an improvement again. All of this is summarized in these assertions regarding the enrolment numbers, their changes across the decade, and the performance of CAT learners in the Free State in various types of schools. CAT enrolment is high in all types of Free State schools relative to other provinces, although it's always been higher in richer than poorer schools, with a gap in enrolment numbers between rich and poor widening across the decade because of severe attrition of CAT from poorer schools. Learners from all schools performed on average well in CAT, although those from richer schools performed significantly better, and their performance has been more stable across the decade than for poor schools. Interestingly, there's been a clear increase, decrease, and then increase in CAT performance for lower quintile schools across the decade. I now briefly present the theory of planned behavior. I also mention 3 important policies which are relevant to changes in learners' enrollment and performance in CAT and IT across the last decade. According to the theory of planned behavior, beliefs affect intentions, which affect behavior. It's therefore important for us to understand the beliefs that are relevant to certain behaviors so that we can understand how to influence them to improve behavior. These are the 3 kinds of belief which affect behavior. I'll now give some examples of each of these kinds of beliefs within the context of a school deciding whether or not to offer CAT or IT, and of a learner deciding whether or not to take either of these subjects. Perceived behavioral control refers, for example, to the learner's or the teacher's perceptions of the control that they can exert over access to the equipment that they need to use in order to pass or to effectively teach and assess CAT or IT. It also refers to their digital literacy, the time that they have available for the tasks that they expected to perform, and the likelihood that they'll be provided with technical and administrative support. Clearly, all of these would be more limiting in a poorer than a richer environment. And a further consequence of these considerations is that these computer-based subjects are more difficult to implement than potentially competing subjects that don't require any use of technology. Subjective norms are the expectations exerted by significant others. For example, expectations that departmental officials, school governing bodies, teachers, parents, and learners have towards schools offering and learners enrolling in these subjects. Subjective norms tend to be affected by what seems feasible in the context, so it's strongly affected by perceptions of behavioral control and by attitudes. Attitudes include school governing bodies, parents, and learners' perceptions of the value of CAT and IT within their context. Relevant attitudes also include teachers' confidence in presenting CAT and IT, and learners' enjoyment of, interest in, and confidence regarding their capacity to learn these subjects. In the developing world, attitudes tend to have less influence on behavior than more practical implications have, particularly than perceptions of behavioral control. Now let's look at some relevant policies over the past decade. In 2013, the progression law began to be implemented in the FET phase. This law states that a learner may only repeat a grade once within a phase. The rest of the time, they need to be progressed to the next grade despite not having passed on the basis of merit. Before 2013, there was a large amount of gatekeeping of learners entering grade 12, particularly in low quintile schools. That means that many learners remained in grade 10 or 11 for several years. Since subsidy and prestige are determined by grade 12 performance, principals tended to allow only learners who were likely to pass grade 12 to enter grade 12. From 2013, this practice was no longer allowed, and as a result, over the next few years, peaking in 2015, progressed learners were flushed through to grade 11 and then to grade 12. High quintile schools were hardly affected by this law, but the law placed an enormous burden on low quintile schools. In 2016, the Department of Basic Education came up with a way of coping with this pressure, the multiple examinations options, which allows learners to split their matric subjects over 2 years. Another policy that's relevant to the study was passed in 2018. Before 2018, universities used only certain designated subjects to determine whether a prospective student qualified for university entrance, and CAT was not one of them. Because of this, some principals and department officials were known to discourage learners from taking CAT and possibly rather urge them to take IT. In 2018, the practice of designating only certain subjects as relevant to university entrance was stopped. However, even if that policy change has changed perceptions of learners entering the FET phase since 2018, such learners would only have reached matric in 2020, and so that wouldn't have been reflected in the data used here, which stops in 2019. I've already provided explanations using the theory of planned behavior of why both enrollment and performance are higher in richer than poorer schools for both CAT and IT. I now suggest an explanation for the CAT attrition across the decade, particularly in poorer schools, and for the fluctuations in CAT performance at poorer schools across the decade. I then propose implications for further research and for practice. During the decade prior to this study's decade, there'd been a strong drive in the Free State to equip low quintile schools to offer CAT. Many companies donated computer labs to these schools, and that seems to have been effective in making the Free State a leader in CAT enrollment at the start of the last decade. Unfortunately, however, there has been a drastic attrition, particularly in poorer schools, for CAT. Why? Firstly, CAT was probably discouraged because it was not a designated subject for university entrance until 2018. This would have decreased attitudes and subjective norms regarding schools offering CAT and learners taking CAT. Secondly, I suggest that the additional stress which the progression law placed on low quintile schools contributed to this attrition. We see the peak in numbers in 2015, when progressed learners were flushed into grade 12, followed by drastic attrition, particularly at low quintile schools. We also see from the performance data a dip in performance in 2014 and 2015 as the weak progressed learners reached grade 12, and as the burden of progression took its toll on all aspects of school life in low quintile schools. After this, we see performance increasing, but with fewer students. So what I suggest happened was that the burden of progression decreased the already limited perceptions that low quintile school teachers had over the control that they can exert on their behavior regarding use of computers to teach CAT. Further, the pressure to offer CAT exerted by subjective norms decreased because people considered it unfair to expect a school to offer CAT when the system was already under so much stress. So many schools stopped offering CAT in grade 10 and phased the subject out as CAT learners were flushed out of the FET phase. Unfortunately, this doesn't mean, though, that if progression is now less of a problem than it was, and if CAT is now included for consideration of university entrance, that CAT enrollment will now necessarily increase. The damage done might be irreversible, or at the least, it will take a lot of effort now to restore CAT to its former glory. Also, this effort may be resisted if the relevant belief issues are not all adequately addressed. Unfortunately, often interventions aimed at spanning the digital divide between rich and poor actually enlarge it, because the rich benefit more from the intervention than the poor do. And that seems to have been the case with CAT. A subject which should be helping poor people break the bonds of poverty seems to be engaged in more by richer learners. I suggest that it would be useful to follow up the research that I performed here with qualitative studies, particularly case studies which focus on the schools that operate against the observed trends. These schools that I suggest should be studied are the special needs schools that have high CAT enrollments and pass rates despite having learners with physical, mental, or behavioral challenges. The low quintile schools that have increased their enrollments and their performance in IT across the last decade. And the low quintile schools that have not succumbed to CAT attrition. From these case studies, we could try to derive suggestions of how to effectively reverse the trends shown in the study. And it's really important that we do manage to find ways to reverse these trends and the loss of opportunity that they show, the waste of having electronic resources in poor schools, but these are not being used, and the intensification of the digital divide in South Africa, which all of these issues suggest. Thank you for watching. Visit my website, learnscience.co.za, to find more movies, including movies about my research, as well as my publications and academic writing resources. I've also included a direct link to the research page of my website below. Finally, I'd appreciate comments about this research and what your experiences with CAT and IT are, and what you think we should do about the situation.